Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This sermon has some political overtones, but it ends in a place of pluralism that I hope will appeal both to those whose ideology leans left and whose ideology leans to the right. The very first Jew was Abraham, and the story has a mysterious beginning if you read it in the Torah. Seemingly out of the blue, God says to Abraham, Lech lecha, leave your home, and Abraham goes, which has always left me with the question, if Abraham's primary mission in life was to tell people about the one true God, why couldn't he do that in Haran, his native land? Why did he have to immigrate to Canaan? There were plenty of people worshiping kings and idols in Haran, so why did he have to leave? The answer can be found in the Midrash, which is a collection of stories told by the rabbis over centuries, and among other things, the Midrash often gives us a backstory, an explanation of why things happen. And so it turns out that Abraham did preach monotheism in Haran, and he did say that the one true God was mightier than any human king, and as you can imagine, King Nimrod, the king of Haran, was not thrilled with this message. He was not thrilled to the point where he ordered that Abraham be tortured and killed, at which point God said, Abraham, you're not safe here. Lech lecha, leave this place, seek asylum in another country. From the very beginning, from the very first Jew, we have been refugees. Rabbi Elliot Kukla points out that you could summarize the entire Torah as the Jews seeking a safe refuge. They go from land to land, often meeting hostility at the borders, sometimes even threatened with violence, until they finally, in our portion, arrive at the border of the land that has been promised to them. In fact, this double portion is called Matot Masei. Masei means journeys, and part of what we can read in the entirety of this Torah portion is the list of all the places they were on this journey, this dangerous time through the desert and the wilderness, seeking refuge. It builds us up to the point where we read this morning describing the borders of our new safe haven. But there's just one little problem with how the borders are described here in the book of Numbers. They are not the same borders described next week in the book of Deuteronomy. And they don't match the borders described in Ezekiel or Kings or Joshua or Genesis. The borders in the Bible change. Is our northern border to go to what is present-day Lebanon or present-day Turkey? Is the border to the east to go only towards what is present-day Damascus or all the way to the Euphrates? Those are very different borders. And borders in the time of the Bible were just as important as they are today, because borders define different governments, different economies, different cultures and languages and foods. When we draw borders around something, we understand what it is we're protecting. In fact, there are biblical scholars who say the whole point of the Torah was to write a book that helped the Israelites distinguish themselves from the Canaanites and the Moabites around them, to develop a unique identity. So if these borders are godly ordained, right? These borders are given by God and not humanity, how do we explain the fact that they are not the same throughout our holy texts? I know, it's very distressing. Some of us might find a solution by saying, look, I believe that the Bible was written by human beings over the course of a long period of time, and then was compiled into one document later. And the borders being described are the borders that existed for those humans in the time period that they were describing their borders. Therefore, the world makes sense. But if you're a person who believes that the Bible was written by God, or at least divinely inspired, or perhaps you're willing to accept that the Bible was written by humanity, but you're looking for a more spiritual answer to why do the borders have inconsistencies in the Bible, then you need a different answer. And here is what I think the point is. The point is not where the boundaries are geographically, because on that point the Bible fails to be clear. The point is that these borders are godly. And furthermore, the point really is the borders change. We know this happens geographically from time to time, whether due to warfare or agreements between governments or even natural occurrences. There's a famous case on the border of Texas and Mexico. Now, the border between those two countries has always been the Rio Grande. However, in 1864, there were torrential rains, and after things cleared up, the Rio Grande had jumped its banks, and land that used to be part of Mexico was now located in Texas. The river moved. This region is called chamizal after a particular plant that grows there. And for 100 years, the Mexican and American governments talked back and forth, what should we do with this piece of land, that 700 acres that switched countries without anyone's permission. And in the meantime, people were living there. There were 5,000 people who had been residents of Mexico who were now residents of the United States. Finally, in 1964, 100 years later, it's a long story, it had to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two governments decide they really need to resolve this territory dispute, and the land is going to go back to Mexico. And people living there have a choice. Do you want to stay put in your homes with your businesses and become citizens of Mexico? Or do you want to move everything you have and stay in the United States? But you can't stay geographically where you are in order to do that. It was a very tumultuous time, as it is when borders shift. And to make sure that this never happened again, the governments of Mexico and the United States says, well, we know what we'll do. We're going to dig a 4-mile-long canal, bless you, to contain the river in this canal so that the border can't shift, to which the residents of that region just laughed. Because you really can't hold back a river forever. Borders change and shift. Human beings have boundaries and borders as well. And that's very important because it helps define our identities. It gives us ideology. It gives us values. It tells us who we are and helps us move through the world with purpose and find a way to make sense of life. But every once in a while, something happens, like the Rio Grande jumping its banks, that causes us to shift the borders and boundaries of how we define ourselves. And that is a moment when we're touched by God. The reason is when our borders and boundaries shift, we're able to think beyond the status quo. And we stop saying things like, well, this is the way it's always been done, or there can't be a solution to. For me, the story of the immigrants who are living on our southern border pushes against my heart. And I have heard from congregants on the left and congregants on the right, everyone is distressed by the tragic stories that bring migrants to our borders and the appalling conditions under which they're being kept at the moment. No one likes our current solution. When the borders of our heart become fluid, we put aside the rhetoric of the left and the rhetoric of the right, and we look to one another and say, we have to come up with a solution for people desperately in need of our cooperation and help. When the borders of our heart become fluid, we stop shaking our heads as we listen to the news and change the channel. And instead, we demand of our leaders, and we say, I need you to stop your party lines and your pettiness, and I need you to reach across the aisle and find a solution that no one's going to like, but everyone will agree is better than what we have. And when the borders of our heart become fluid, they lead us to stop our lethargy and our fatigue and give of our resources, our time, our money, our energy, in whatever is right for us through our own personal boundaries, right? The way we define ourselves, to help alleviate the suffering in the world. When the children of Israel arrived in the Promised Land after this long, dangerous journey, they wanted nothing more than to settle down and define their borders and be safe and secure and be able to defend them. That's not what they got, because according to the Bible, if you read it in detail, the borders don't stay put. And that's because the borders are given to us by God, and the whole point is that borders change. What we want is to be secure. What we get is to be challenged to answer the broken call of the world. So may we recognize our borders, may we have good definitions of self, but may we also recognize that according to God, to get things done in God's world, those borders constantly change. Shabbat Shalom.